Yeah, so this is not the official talk yet. I just thought it was a nice kind of warm up, maybe to show those of you what research scientists like Peter Houk do. So that's where I met Pete as well in 2016. This was a coral research trip that lasted for a month, almost 4 weeks, which was organized by the Nature Conservancy in cooperation with the University of Guam, and all under the wing of the Micronesia Challenge, which I believe Pete's going to talk about today. And we were on board of this ship, and we were supposed to cruise for several atolls, so not only Chuuk, but also some outlying atolls. We had some minor difficulties, so we stayed in the area of Chuuk and gave it the biggest ever reef check that's ever been done in, I think, any part of Micronesia, but I'll let Peter correct me later on that. This is what Chuuk Micronesia looks like. A lot of really amazing little islands in crystal clear blue water. What they're famous for really are the wrecks. So if you have never heard of Chuuk, you might have heard of Truk Lagoon. That's what it is famous for. You could call it the wreck dive capital of the world. We go there actually every year with insider divers. It's really one of the best places in the world to dive. You get amazing shipwrecks. There's over 60 wrecks lying there in the bay, fully overgrown with beautiful corals. There's also some really special diving that you can't get from in many other places, fully complete trucks, for example, in the Hoki Maru and things like that. But we were there to look at the state of the fisheries and the corals, and that's essentially what Peter's going to talk about today. Chuuk is actually an archipelago with a very large territory compared to the population, and yet they've been able to fish it quite extensively with local fishing methods, like you can see here, shore-based or off rafts, but also by allowing foreign fleets to come in and fish. So in some places we would find a lot of sharks. I was actually the one taking pictures of the sharks. Sharks were not counted, was not part of this survey, but I would go out and try and find sharks. And for example, silvertips, in some sites you could get really, really close to them, really big, the biggest silvertips I've ever seen. Not on the outside like you have them in the Maldives, but on the inside of the atoll you would get these big silvertips. So a healthy reef population in some areas, and then other areas absolutely zero. And one part of the research suggested that it was because these reefs were given free for fisheries from abroad, maybe China, I'm not sure. And so there were not that many sharks in other areas. But we were there for the corals, and Chuuk actually has amazing coral growth, just like many of the Pacific islands, like Palau or Yap or any of these places. But it was very, very diverse what you got there. And essentially what the scientists there did was coral surveying. So you can see here they would have these slates, and they would go along transects. Here's actually Pete himself along this line. You can see the line in the background. So they would have transects along a 10-meter line and a 5-meter line, and they would have to count specific corals and invertebrates, and other people would be counting fish. So everybody had their task, what they were counting, and you can see here on his board they were counting it manually. Some people were documenting it with photos as well, but essentially it had to be quantified, so it was a count. Some research, this is what Pete did as well, was looking what's inside a square. I believe he's going to talk about that today as well. You look at this square and you think there's not much going on, but you will see somebody like Pete spending a good 10 minutes on this, and later he will say that he's found whatever 50 different corals on there, and you can barely see anything. That's because the trained eye looks for things that we as an untrained or non-scientist cannot see. They would then take all the information up on the ship, and they would all hack it into computers so that we could have intermediate results. These were discussed. This was a lead scientist, Robert, and he was then compiling the data on ship already, and they were making it ready so that we could share this with the local community. So we did several local community visits and outreaches where essentially, yeah, you can see Pete here on the right, meet the locals and try to convey what was found. and help them in convincing them to establish marine protected areas, MPAs, which to some degree was successful. So there would be these village sit-downs where the traditional reef owners, which are all family-owned reefs, would then have to sort of think about if they would agree to having catch limitations, size limitations, as in don't fish anything that's smaller than a certain size and bigger than a certain size, so keep away from certain areas entirely, and stop fishing certain fish entirely or fish them only certain times a year. This is what the scientists try to bring through, and as far as I understood, to some degree successful. So here's the end of one of these outreach situations. So you can see a lot of the scientists here together with the locals and some of the local researchers as well. So that was how I met Pete. We basically shared the same boat for a month. And so I'm very glad to welcome him here today and talk about this topic, because I learned a lot from him about corals and fisheries and how they all work together. So I thought better than me trying to explain that to you guys, just let the professor do it himself. So he's here today. Just before we start, a couple words about Insider Divers. If you don't know us, we do land-based and liveaboard scuba diving trips. We also organize specific trips, such as, for example, wreck trips to Truck Lagoon, but we also do free diving trips, for example, with whales or dolphins, and specific things like photography workshops, because I'm a photographer, so that's kind of my specialty. So these are the kind of trips we organize. They're always group trips, so we don't really offer individual trips. It's always in a group. There's always an expert like myself, or a scientist, or an instructor, a photographer, tech instructor, somebody who's in the know, and they will make sure it's a specialized itinerary, an itinerary that is hard to replicate when you're by yourself or if you're a small group. And so we try to add education and coaching into the mix. Every trip there will be some learning opportunity, as in we will always have talks by one of us or by locals or local scientists. During this period of COVID-19, I was thinking, we should really continue this intention of learning, and so I started what I call Insider Academy, just for a lack of a better name. We're called Insider Divers, so we call this Insider Academy, and we've been doing a lot of webinars. So if you haven't checked it out yet, on youtube.com Insider Divers, we have almost 30 now webinars that are all recorded. I've edited them a little bit so that they're really nice to watch. Lots about photography. We've got several talks about sharks, manta rays, and photographers, as well as scientists coming in talking about certain topics. So go check it out and make sure you don't miss a topic that you might like. So just a couple words on Zoom. If this is your first time, you may have noticed you're already turned off your audio and your video, and we will keep it like that, just because if everybody starts talking, we've now got 35 people in here, and it'll probably be a couple more in the next 20 minutes. Joining, we want everybody's audio and video off, but we've got two tools how we can communicate. One is the Q&A, and one is the chat. Some of you already said hello in the chat. This is where I'd like you to just put any comments you can also message to yourselves directly. You can say hi to us or make any comments. But the Q&A, please put that for questions you would like answered by Pete, because I'm going to manage that for him, and I am going to then answer them in the right order to him. Maybe I'll put some together, etc. So just put your Q&A, your questions in the Q&A, and all your other comments in the chat, so that we don't clog up the Q&A with hi if I'm dialing in from wherever. If we do turn on your audio, which is rather unlikely, but if we do, so then make sure you control your sound and turn it off again after you said what you wanted to say, because otherwise later you might forget that the microphone is on and we might hear you clearing your throat or something. So without further ado, I would like to invite Dr. Peter Houk from the University of Guam. Peter, can you show yourself? There he is. Hi there. I think your audio is still off.
Greetings. Thanks, Simon. Really appreciate it.
Welcome, welcome. I'm just going to turn off my screen just so we can see you in the flesh. You can say hi to everybody.
All right. So, can I go and join my screen now, Simon? Is that all right?
Yeah, you can. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, cool.
Okay, so I'm just going to unmute myself. I'll be in the background, but when you see my video pop up, then I probably have a question for you.
Okay, no problem. Hey, feel free to interrupt me anytime if there are any questions. Thank you everyone for logging in and joining on, evening, whenever it is during your time. I appreciate it. I always have a fun time talking about corals and coral reef futures. And here really I'm going to be talking about kind of like what's been driving my research over the years. I'm very much a conservation-oriented coral reef ecologist and fisheries biologist. And this is just kind of like the path in which kind of drove me to where I'm at. And I think it hopefully I'll have some nice stories and pictures for you to follow. So before I start, it's very important for me because there's just too many people that have contributed in very significant ways to all of the research that I've done. Here's just a few of them, but I just want to recognize we have an amazing group of regional partners. And so we partner with nonprofit organizations across Micronesia, which is the tropical North Pacific, essentially from Palau over to the Marshall Islands. So it's a quite big band of the ocean, and that's kind of where we develop our information from. So I guess I'll just start out with this amazing photo, one of my favorite photos that Simon has ever taken. So I selfishly asked Simon if I could use this. I think it's wonderful. But really it shows, to me, it just really depicts what you see when you go diving. And just look at that amazing diversity that's on the reef. And as a scientist, as a young scientist, you can't help but marvel at that diversity and say, how is it possible that there are so many different species of coral in that one photographic frame right there? How does that exist? And if that's not your first question, that's usually one of your first questions as a scientist or as a diver. So in order to understand that, I'm going to first delve into that, and then I'm going to talk a little bit more about conservation and kind of the path towards fisheries and why all that matters. But in order to understand that very first question, the diversity question, why are there so many species?
Peter, just before we start, because we've got your audio and your video separate, some people can't see your screen. So everybody, if you click on gallery view, you should be able to see both of us. Just let me know in your comments if that's still not working. I can see Pete here in the gallery view. Just click in the top right hand corner, speaker view and gallery view, and you should be able to see both of us right now. Just let me know if you can't.
Okay.
But you should be seeing. Yes. Okay, hang on a second. How can we fix this? Because the thing is, it's not automatically. Hang on a second. Let me just see. How can I do this?
So they can see the slides, but they're not able to see anything.
No, they can hear you, but because you remember you have your audio on your computer and your camera on your phone, they just see. Yeah. So Kai, do you have the option of clicking gallery view, speaker view in the top right hand corner? Let me just see. I can pin this video. Okay, I've now pinned this video. Now people should be able to see him, but not me. Kai, is that working for you now? Ah, okay, some people who are using the smartphone is not working. I've pinned your video. What else can we do? So guys, if you click on gallery view, it should be possible. Well, now they can't see it. Sorry, we're going to figure this out. I'm going to stop my video for starters. Now it should be just one video left, really. And I've pinned your video. Okay, I think people can see you now. All right, we should be good. I think I'm going to just keep my video off for now. All right.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks, Simon. Sorry about that. Obviously more important to see the slides.
That's right.
Anyway, as I was saying, we're just delving into this kind of magnificent world of diversity. And I understand that everyone on here is an avid scuba diver at some point in their life. And so at some point, I'm sure they've taken note of that. And the first important thing I want to note is what made this hyperdiversity in coral reef environments, especially with corals, able to happen was a symbiosis. And so here's a close-up of a coral polyp, and you can see the polyp right there, and that's the clear kind of jelly-like thing, looking like a jellyfish sticking out, and that can capture plankton in the water and eat them. But at the same time, you see these tiny brown cells on the bottom, and those are plant cells, just like chloroplast in a plant. And those things are harnessing sunlight. So this is an interesting relationship. The coral lets these algae live inside of their tissue, and this evolved many, many years ago. And in exchange, the coral gets a lot of their food, sometimes up to 80% of their food, depending on the habitat they live in, can come from these algae cells that live in their tissue. So we have this relationship. Corals let them live inside of their tissue. Algae cells then provide coral with a lot of food. And we have this kind of mutual partnership. And when this evolved 210 million years ago, coral species diversity started flourishing. Not only did coral species diversity started flourishing, some of these shallow water reefs, this is just a gorgeous picture that I took. This is overlooking the Marshall Islands. That's a group of atolls in Micronesia. And you see these beautiful reefs sticking out. And these gorgeous reefs were all built because the reefs still would have been built, but they would never have been built to this extent without this symbiotic partnership that exists. So it allowed this kind of shallow water habitat essentially to be created. So all of this beautiful world that we celebrate, love, and know, really we owe down back to that partnership. So here's just a picture of some of the coral diversity. There's a picture of one of the quadrats that we look at and we assess what types of corals and their sizes inside of there on reefs. So now I'm going to get into the patterns. So it's not the same. Diversity is not the same everywhere we look. And I think this is one of the interesting things in that the darker the color here on this map, the higher the coral diversity, or the larger the number of coral species. So you might be a diver, or maybe you've already done this. As a diver, you look at this and say, I'm going to dive in that dark center right there in the middle, because that's what I want to see. I want to see this hyperdiversity, and it's beautiful. And I've done that, and maybe many other people have done that too as well. But these patterns evolved, and people like me, not just me, but many, many people before me have been thinking about this and said, what is the driver of these patterns? So this is kind of the first thing. So on the bottom here, I've kind of showed you what generally are the drivers, what people thought initially were the drivers of these patterns. So the first one was temperature. They found out corals can only exist essentially between 20 degrees south and 20 degrees north. So a certain temperature range. The second thing, why are there so many species, was geology. Let's just take a look at how much shallow water habitat exists. And if we look at it, you see the temperature range and the geology is highest in the area that's called the Indo-West Pacific right there. But really, we know it's a little bit more complicated than that. So over the years, we found out that it's a little bit more complicated than that. I'm not going to get too into this. I'm just trying to show you that it's deeper than that. So it has to do with productivity in the ocean. Productivity is like upwelling spots. It does have to do with temperature and solar energy. It also has to do with wind. Too much wind drives too many waves, and then you only can have wave-tolerant species. But when the waves are very low or calm, you can have both wave-tolerant and non-tolerant. And then we have geology or bathymetry. And essentially, if we layer all of these things together, we can end up with a map right there, which is some research I had done before, where we can predict coral diversity at a smaller scale. And you know, this is where you could have some fun and predict where you want to dive on your next trip if you're enjoy coral diversity, fish diversity, and invertebrate diversity often follows this as well. So that diversity pattern I just showed you across the world, across the Pacific Ocean, it also holds at a local scale. So here's one island. This is the island of Yap in Micronesia. You may have known Yap for the stone money. But anyway, on this map right here, you simply have the warmer colors showing you the higher diversity. And here, when we look at the local scale, we see other factors drive coral diversity. So watersheds, wave energy, depth, of course, human stressors. So there's all these things that combine to determine what diversity is going to be. And we have to think about it on a regional scale and on a local scale as well. So there's two different things that are going on there. So I'm going to take this a little further and have some fun with it before I get into what does it all mean. So I just got a couple of slides here to kind of take a look at it. And one of the things that people have found is that like I told you, the coral has an animal part to it. That's the polyp that's sticking out and trying to eat plankton that drift by. And then there's those algae that live inside of the coral and produce the energy. And it turns out that when your food source is heterogeneous, meaning it comes from more than one place, so these high islands, they have terrestrial runoff, they have some sediments, which are very good for the corals, the sediments, and they feed the corals. The corals can eat the plankton that come from these sediments, so long as there's not too much of them. Versus an atoll, on an atoll, don't have any sediments whatsoever. And so in general, if you look at any two atolls or high islands that are next to each other anywhere in the ocean, the high island will always have more species of coral. I learned this the hard way by going on one of these trips like Simon explained, and they said, what leg do you want to go on? I said, I want to go on those atoll trips because I've never seen the atolls. And this 10-year veteran said, okay, I'll take all the high islands where the people live. And that was my experience in learning to missing out on seeing all of the coral species. I got tricked a little bit, but I learned to be smarter later on. Okay, so I just want to put a second view of diversity because I think we've kind of seen this. I'm just going to break this down a little bit. We have a picture with a group of species of coral, and you can think of every species of coral as a shape. So there's shapes right there, and then you can think of the amount of resources, the amount of energy, the amount of sunlight, the amount of sediment running off onto the reef, like we were talking about before, as this available resource pool. And you can think of this as playing Jenga now. You can basically take your coral species and put them in the box and play Jenga. And we can have a typical reef right here. In this case, we have all of the resources fit perfectly for species 1 and 3, but species 2 gets left out in this situation. So typically what you see on a reef, you get moderate diversity. You have a moderate black box of resources being available. But you have some sweet spots where the wave energy gets lower, as that map predicted. And when the wave energy gets lower, you can fit in more species. And so that's what we're getting at here. Now, there's one problem with all of this. You can have too much of a good thing. So if we pollute our watersheds, if we clear all the trees in the watershed, we end up with way more resources than we want. Our black box gets really huge. And when our black box gets really huge, we pile in a dominant competitor. So, and if you see that picture right there, maybe you've seen some habitats like this, probably diving. You see large monostands. You can see these in channels, especially. Channels are very, very productive areas with large black boxes in this picture. But you don't typically see this out on like floor reefs or just on typical patch reefs. So this can be too much of a good thing. And the larger you make your black box, the more threatening you are to the system. Okay, so I'm going to go into this. What do we do with these diversity patterns now? And this kind of starts getting into the conservation and management side of it as we slowly evolve into that a little bit. I would say two things. The first is we have to categorize that. So we've all been to museums, or if you don't know, there's a wonderful museum in Paris, but there are many other ones around the world, and they have all these coral skeletons that have been categorized over the years by many, many wonderful scientists. And you can pull out these skeletons and learn from them. And so that's how we know how many species are on what reefs, and that forms the basis for how we do our monitoring. I would never know what the names of any of these corals were if it wasn't for the categorization process. The second thing we do with these diversity measures that we have is we protect the reef. So this is kind of where the conservation angle starts from this talk here. So at first, when people first got excited like me and said, oh man, and they started diving all around the world, we said, look at this. I found the spot that has the highest biological diversity on coral reefs. We absolutely have to protect these spots. Why? Because it's diverse. That's simply the answer. But then later, as time went by, we started thinking about that a little more. Don't get me wrong, that beautiful food web right there on the right is gorgeous. And that produces a lot of species, and we love looking at it. But besides beauty, we can think about this a little bit more. Does high diversity give us more fish to eat, or does it just give us more species? Does it give us more tourism opportunities? Is it more resistance? And so things like that started coming into play. And it turns out the answer was yes to some of the questions and no to some of the other questions. For instance, high diversity is wonderful, but it doesn't necessarily give you more fish to eat. It usually does give you more tourism opportunities, and it usually does give you more resilience to climate change. But there was another problem in all of this kind of logic. Here we are trying to make these grandiose plans with major nonprofit organizations that are globally reaching and saying, how are we going to protect coral reefs as an ecosystem in this world moving forward? What are we going to do? Well, we want to protect these areas is what people are saying. And they're saying, well, you know what? These areas are so far away from where humans live, these high diversity areas. That's the way it turns out. That's almost always the way it turns out, that it's almost impossible to do any meaningful type of enforcement and any regular monitoring of this. So a couple things emerged then. How is all this protection? We're spending all this money on protecting biological diversity. How is this helping the people? How is this helping the people that rely on this resource? Don't get me wrong, these places are beautiful and they should be protected, but we needed a more tangible approach that was more people-centric. So I was on this train for a little bit of while. Here's kind of like a typical thing that you would do. You would go and do these surveys. You would look for where you have like the highest diversity. You would make some recommendations for a series of marine protected areas, which are areas where you have limited access, limited rights to fish. You kind of lock up these areas, just like the national parks in the United States. Kind of set these areas aside, if you will. And that's definitely part of the solution, but it wasn't enough of the solution. And so this kind of leads into, I guess, the next chapter or the next direction of this talk right here. So in 2006, I joined on to this to contribute to this movement. This movement was called the Micronesia Challenge. So this exists from Palau all the way to the Marshall Islands, including Guam and CNMI, or the Northern Mariana Islands. And this was really unique because this came from the political leaders. So we had the political leaders, not just someone on the ground saying, hey, they should do something about that. But who's they? You know, that's a very difficult thing. But here we had this kind of conservation movement based upon some consultations that originated from the presidents or the governors of these island nations that I'm showing you in this map. And they said by the year 2020, we're going to have 30% of our reefs under effective management, and we're going to set it up as a challenge. Houk is going to challenge Ponape, and Ponape is going to challenge, and so on and so on and so on. And we're going to see how this kind of plays out. And so this set the stage for building networks, research networks like mine. It also set the stage for building funding networks. So raising $1 to protect your backyard is kind of hard, and you can't raise that much. But when you're trying to raise $1 to protect an entire swath of ocean, you'd be surprised. It's a lot easier to convince people, whether it's big NGOs or whomever. So we learned that working together is way better than working independently. So that's the Micronesia Challenge. There's a little website on it. I'm not going to get too much into it, but I will share some of the results from kind of what we've seen. So that was our goal right there in 2006. And so we set off right there with our transect lines. It's the photo you can see in the top left right there. And we started monitoring the reefs. And we are at an amazing point right now. We have a database with hundreds of thousands of individual fish measurements, hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of coral measurements. And we have this data from over 200 sites across 17, 18, 19 island nations right now. So you have this huge, really powerful growing data to teach us. Just like the way Google collects analytics, we love to collect analytics to teach us how to respond to climate change, how to respond to all of these stressors, and how we can potentially manage them, at least the best that we can. So in our initial assessment, what did we find? So I'm not gonna give you the gory scientific details here, but in general, the initial assessment, what we found right here was pretty straightforward. We found that if we were documenting reefs, so I'm showing you a reef right there in the upper left, there's kind of a healthy reef, and then we see a disturbance. In this case, it's a starfish. I think maybe you all know about these crown of thorns starfish that prey on corals. And what happens sometimes is the reefs don't recover. That's the third picture we see. And in those instances where we start looking at the reef and the reef dies and the reefs don't recover, or they don't recover on time, we see there's a problem with fishing and fisheries. And we found that not at one site or two sites, but we started seeing that site after site, island after island, and we started honing in on what are the fish species of greatest concern here. So we want to understand what's the main driver. Don't get me wrong, pollution's a big driver on some of these reefs, but we found a disproportional influence on fishing pressure. And this is simply because on a lot of these island nations, you might have one or two watersheds with hotels and restaurants, but the majority of that island is just a green watershed. That's the way these islands work, these sparse populations. And so what we found was even more interesting, but it was the commercial fisheries. So a subsistence fisherman, so me, I want to go eat dinner, a subsistence fisherman might go out on the reef. And in fact, we found that subsistence fishing on average takes almost 5 times as much fish as commercial fishing. So there's 5 pounds of fish taken to eat for every 1 pound taken by commercial fishing. Yet we found commercial fishing has a bigger ecological footprint. So despite the disproportional balance, what this meant was subsistence fishing was targeting totally different species. Commercial fishing was targeting these large iconic species that you see in the images up there on the right. Subsistence fishing targets these smaller fishes because they just want plate-sized fish to eat for dinner right then and there, and they want to go get them again the next day. And the larger fish grow slower and they have a disproportional ecological function, as I'm showing you in the pictures. So those big parrotfish, you can see their teeth marks on the reef, and that can lead to yet another beautiful picture that Simon got to take in 2006.
Can you just go one slide back?
Sure.
No, one slide back, sorry. I was just asked about the green water thingy. Huh. Wastewater that runs directly into the sea.
Absolutely. I mentioned that briefly, but the main gist I would say right now is definitely that exists. But on these island nations, most of the island nations that we do work on that exist, that coral reefs exist on, you typically only have 1 or 2 watersheds that have any type of discharge as such as you're describing.
That was the word, sorry, yeah.
Yeah. And so what we found in our study, even though we monitored all of the reefs, we found that fishing pressure was a disproportionately larger footprint. In fact, we found it was something like 65% of the reef decline was attributed to fishing pressure, whereas like 30%, or actually 25% was attributed to pollution.
I remember that the worst reef we saw that year was it was in the runoff of an island and right in front of a village that we're fishing. And you guys were saying that reef's beyond repair, basically. That was, remember that? It was right in front of, I don't remember the name, but one of the communities where we also went for the talk. And it was one reef which was just complete dead. And that was kind of a combination of the two, I think.
Absolutely. And so I think that happens. We're probably all familiar with a situation like the San Francisco Bay or certain water bodies that become polluted, and it takes in a heroic force and a lot of money to clean up that water body and fix that particular reef. But again, to go back to what we were talking about, was when we looked at all the reefs in general, all of the reefs around the island, if you were to put a polygon around all of those reefs, we would find that the majority of them actually had very, very clean water quality, but they had a situation with the fishing pressure.
So maybe we go to the next slide with for the fishing pressure, not the one with the, well, maybe the first one with the spearfishers. So what is the primary fishing pressure then? The method, is it nets or is it spear guns or what is it?
Sure. For this one, it's definitely it's spear guns and night flashlights. So just like you go diving at night, these guys go diving at night and they spear the sleeping fish.
So it's spearing.
Definitely. Yeah. And again, I'll get to this later, but in all the data we've collected in the fisheries now, we found that something like 80% of the catch comes from night spearfishing. And that's across like 15 islands. So it's quite prevalent.
I think this is a very interesting thing to note because there is obviously quite a big trend to spearfishing, particularly in first world countries as well. So Australia, America, Mediterranean, we see lots of spearfishing and it's considered a sport and it's considered fair game. But sometimes I see the pictures of what they're pulling out. They're pulling out really seriously huge animals. that might be extremely important in terms of their reproductive. Are you going to talk about that aspect, like the sizes? I don't know if that's going to be relevant.
Yeah, absolutely. We kind of, at the end of this, kind of at the end of the talk, we kind of have a, we tried to go through this for one island, but it's difficult as you suggest, to get at it. But because when you make a regulation, it's a blanket regulation for everybody: the responsible fishermen, the heroic fishermen, and also just the commercial fishermen, right? And so a regulation affects everyone equally, whether or not you're responsible or not. And so these are the difficulties that are that we face right now.
But I think an important thing that I would love to point out to whoever is watching is spearfishing is not always right. Lots of people say because it's spearfishing, it's a natural way of fishing. It doesn't make it right. You still need to respect, you know, the local conditions. And if you can fish that fish, you should know if it's, you know, you should know the fish that you're fishing, I think, and know if it's, for example, under threat.
I totally agree.
All right.
Yeah. So yeah, feel free to we can pause at any time. So these were some of the pictures that we were able to collect. If you're interested, we have a website, Micronesia, I think it's micronesiafishing.com, right? And so we created like journals. We have 9 issues. It's basically Micronesia fishermen talking to other Micronesia fishermen, sharing their images. And we wanted to understand the culture of fishing. Before we go in and collect data, we want to understand the culture of fishing and fisheries, because part of conservation is working with people, obviously. Scientists often jump straight to the data, but it's very important to consider the people. So these are kind of some of the heroic. You can see what they're targeting, commercial fishermen here, the big ones, the ones we were talking about, not the ones for subsistence. The people that were going out and just getting some fish for dinner were targeting very different species. So that led to a more of a network. So now we hung up the transect lines. So instead of just using transect lines, now we bring up the cameras and the measuring boards, and we start working closer with fishermen. And this is something that we've been doing in partnerships all across the region. And we found some really interesting findings right off the bat. So first of all, if you know anything about coral reef fisheries, you know there's a lot of species. On many reefs, there's over 1,000 reef fish species that you can see in any particular week or so of diving. And that's the case with the coral reef fishery too, the ones that they want to eat. We found that there's over 200 species of fish in the fishery, but only 9 species could make up to 50% of the landings. So that was really a big deal, right? And you can see we've put dollar values on some of these fishes so you can kind of understand them. And I guess, you know, one of the things I was getting at here was that, so if we tell the fishermen to stop fishing, so these are kind of like my red talking points there, but we tell the fishermen to stop fishing, but we have this great tourism industry that's coming in. And tourism is great, but a lot of these islands, tourists are package deals. Tourists want a guaranteed local package deal, something that they book. These package deals often take all the money that you pay, leave about 20% on the island, and take 80% off the island to, it could be Korea, China, or whomever is operating that package tourism in Island X. And that's pretty typical of the situation. So one of the things that we need to think of, all of us, not just me, but in planning my trips too, I always think, how is it possible that I can keep as much money on the island while I'm doing my trip?
When we go to Chuk, we do use a local operator, locally owned, locally operated. There's no foreigners working in the Blue Lagoon, you know, the Blue Lagoon.
Sure, yeah, absolutely.
But in some places, it's really hard to find a local. Like in Palau, there's very difficult to get a local operator.
Yeah, so and I know it's not possible everywhere, and I know every island has a different lay of the land, but I think it's worth a chance, like doing a little bit of research and spending some time as being a conservation-oriented tourist, you know. Anyway, so what we're realizing is that, of course, without an income source, fishing pressure will obviously remain to be high. Here are some of the catches, some cool catches. This is from Chuk. right here. And so one of the first management tools, so we have to manage this fishing pressure. While we're doing all these things, trying to create jobs, these are big, grandiose things. That's almost like, you know, how are we combating climate change? That's almost bigger than some of us, right? We can combat, I can change the way I do my travel, but how are we going to change the way everyone does their travel, right? So at the same time, we're trying to be smarter, more conservation-oriented tourists. We want to think about, of course, our mindset is, okay, well, what are we going to do to manage the fishery? So herein lies the next kind of part of this talk, which I'll call the MPA revolution. So the MPA is a marine protected area. And there's no island like Yap to really show you how important marine protected areas are. This is a men's house in Yap. Every single village has a men's house like this. And the men used to, and still do, sit in it up to 1 day or several hours before they go fishing. They just sit there and stare out at the water, thinking about where they're going to fish, how they're going to fish, what they're going to do with their catch. And there's a lot of cultural dialogue that happens in these men's houses. And so we took to interviewing and talking to people from here in kind of establishing marine protected areas in conjunction with traditional knowledge. So no-take areas have long been used in almost all island cultures, but they were periodic. They would be no-take for like 2 months until a funeral happened. And then they would open them again. And here our Western kind of way was to bring in and say, hey, because the fisheries are getting depleted all around, let's think about keeping them closed for several years. Let's get some data and let's kind of have a look at it. So this kind of, in Micronesia at least, this really started in Yap about like 10 or 15 years ago. And you can see there's a map of Yap right there. And I put a red circle around one of the really kind of neat sites. And those are the reefs we saw when we got there. And when they locked up their reef in a marine protected area and really enforced it, like some communities do, we saw an immediate change, not only to the fish composition, but also to the reef health, right? And so this happened within 2 to 3 years, right? So there's this awesome change. And if you're rooting for nature, then you obviously are very excited about a picture like this. But if you're a fisherman and you can't eat those fish, you might have a different opinion about this marine protected area. So we're going to get to that in a little bit. So there's just a graph just showing you across the different marine protected areas. From one marine protected area, I showed you a picture of one, and now I'm showing you 6 marine protected areas. So what happened was this concept of marine protected areas spread quite successfully in Yap. They created a group, a conservation-oriented group, and these groups were supported by nonprofit organizations, by data collection, by continuous feedback. It was this kind of like this fun and constant dialogue that every scientist would dream of being a part of, you know? So I felt very honored and cherished and blessed to be a part of this dialogue and watching stuff like this emerge.
One question, this is just, these bars are just fish, not coral, right? You're counting fish density.
Absolutely, yes. And I'm going to show some results of the coral on the next slide.
Okay, sorry.
Yeah. And so what they found were these marine protected areas had extended benefits. One of the benefits was on Yap, after these marine protected areas were established, a wave of crown of thorns starfish came in. I think this was in 2009 or 2010 or something like that. And I'll just tell you the story of this one MPA, number 17 right there. They had problems with enforcement. And so this is pretty cool. They built a bamboo floating raft and they pay their community members $15. And this is supported by donations, completely donations to their nonprofit organization. And every night, one community member sleeps in that raft and they don't need guns and big boats. They simply just kayak up to an intruding fisherman and kindly ask the fisherman to leave. And that has worked in 95% of the cases. In only 5 very, very few cases have they had to go to court or had any main issue. The point is, simple is better than complex, and simple can work. That's the lesson. The second lesson we learned is, in that marine protected area, sorry about the graph, I don't have too many graphs on here, but here's what we're just generally trying to show is that the corals were actually increasing in size. So from 2007 to 2011, the corals got bigger in this marine protected area and in general. We see this increase. Now elsewhere, the crown of thorns had done their damage and the crown of thorns were making the corals smaller. So people don't know exactly what causes crown of thorns to come out when they do. We have some ideas. People kind of had an idea that fish might protect against crown of thorns, but they didn't have much proof. This was kind of some of the first proof where we could see that intact fisheries actually help mitigate reef disturbances from crown of thorns. This was later shown in Fiji. It was again later shown in Australia on the Great Barrier Reef. So we've seen this more and more kind of frequently. So this just kind of builds onto the trend.
Can I sorry, can I ask one question from the audience?
Sure.
So I think it's a very good question. What is the largest benefit of corals from the fish? You just said, for example, the crown of thorn starfish are being reduced by it. But here's also the question, clearly it's a expert question, is it mainly the algae grazers, so the fish that graze off the algae growth, or is it the nutrients coming from the fish waste, so the poo?
Right. And what people have generally been documenting is that it's mainly the algae grazers, but it's not just the algae grazers, it's also the predators and the sharks. And the reason is because the algae grazers come in different shapes and sizes. Do you remember that diversity box that I showed? You can fit more species in. You have less dead open space if you can fit more species in. So the more species you can pack in, right? The more species you can pack in, the more grazing will happen on that reef. In order to pack in the biggest number of species, you need predators to take out any one dominant species. So it's incredibly important. Yes, the grazers, but the grazing can't happen without predators being
But is it
around.
only the grazing, or is it also like the waste, the excrements that the fish produce? That was the question.
Oh, I see what you're saying. That are supporting the coral regrowth.
Yeah.
Or in this case right here, very specifically, the fish, we don't know which species still until now. The fish, probably the predators and the invertebrates had some direct impact on the crown of thorn starfish. Now, I have some students that take these crown of thorn starfish out and they put them down on the reef and they put a GoPro camera on them and they watch it for hours. And I wish I could show you some of the highlights. I don't have them right now, but you would be surprised what fish come up and they go ahead and destroy them. And it's those same fish that the commercial fisheries are kind of pulling away and taking apart. So those are not the herbivores. Now, when it comes to recovery,
what fish, for example, are eating the crown of thorns?
Like trevallies were one of them. Red snappers were another one of them. Triggerfish were another one of them. Napoleon wrasse were another one of them. But it wasn't any. Everyone thinks it's just one fish. This is the fish that does it. We didn't find any evidence. It's many, many fish.
And they eat the crown of thorns? Because I mean, they seem pretty hard to eat.
Right. They like to flip them over and eat the bottom of what you can see Lorenzo in that picture is holding up.
Yeah.
So they will actually work to try and flip that starfish over and attack it from the bottom like that.
So I'm going to ask a question here while we're at the crown of thorns, because it's a common question that we get on the trips. So crown of thorns starfish, coral killer, nobody wants them. There's like no reason why anybody wants them, right? But what is it okay for a recreational diver with no scientific background? What is okay for us to do? Like I often, because that's what I watched you guys do, is, you know, I often poke them with the pointer and drop them over deep water. But I'm not sure that's what you guys actually want us non-professionals to do. So what is your recommendation when we see crown of thorns, which we very often do all over Asia? So what is your recommendation?
Yeah, honestly, okay, first of all, that's one myth. By dropping them in deep water, actually, there's more and more evidence that shows that they actually live in deep water and they migrate up to the shallows when it's time to spawn. And so that's actually not necessarily a good thing. That's not totally proven. It's not good to cut them in half either because they're known to regenerate. If you cut them in half, there's a potential that those two halves can make two different individuals. It doesn't happen all the time. We've done it in the tanks, and it doesn't happen all the time, but it does happen quite often. The best thing that you can do is, I'll show a slide from Koshrai later on, but in Koshrai, they asked the tourists to join in on a crown of thorn cleaning dive. And in Koshrai, what they did was they have tourists and they do it in a professional way. It's a Koshrai Diver Association, and they go and they spend 1 or 2. So if they're diving for 1 week in Koshrai, they ask the divers to not do a glorious photo-based dive for 1 or 2 dives of their trip, and instead to help clean the reef. And you'd be surprised, a lot of divers said yes. And so this doesn't exist on too many islands, but Koh Shrai was very unique in setting that up. And I thought that was really cool, and without doubt, the best thing you could do.
So you would just, like, the only way is to actually remove them from the water.
Out of the water is the only proven way. You can inject them with salts too, but there's no way a diver is going to be carrying around an injection gun with salts.
So if I'm on a liveaboard, we take them out and then just have to wait until we hit land to throw them out, feed them to the birds.
Sufficiently keeping them on deck sufficiently long enough kills them too, of course.
Sorry, there was so much on the crown of thorns, but that's a personal one that I've always. But I just gave you some more questions on the crown of thorns. I know I'm ripping apart your presentation, but is there the good question? I think, is there actually an ecosystem function of the crown of thorns? There always
Absolutely,
is.
yeah.
What is their function?
Is there an ecosystem function of fire in a forest? Of course there is. There's an absolute ecosystem function to crown of thorns. The problem is, can we handle that natural ecosystem function in today's world? A long time ago, we'd say, yeah, there's too much of this particular coral on this reef, and we need to increase the diversity. So every once in a while, and this is, the same thing with forests. As you know, we have to induce fires in forests in the Pacific Northwest or in California in some instances. So yes, there is a natural function. But in today's world, where we have climate change, which I'm going to show you again later, some images, we don't need the function of the crown of thorns. Climate change is doing more than enough to knock the coral down and allow other corals to grow in. So it's one of those situations where a long time ago, naturally, yes, but there's a debate now, and I'm on the side that says, no, now we're at the point where we need to control them.
Okay.
It's my personal stance.
Sorry for the big interruption.
That's okay. But this is very important. We've been talking about marine protected areas and what do they do? Well, this was the ultimate one. The fishermen wanted to know this. Okay, so this is the ultimate one right here. I thought I had the map there, but this is what we see. We see like basically fishermen and the amount of fish and the size of the fish that they catch. It's always proportional to the amount of people that live right next to the reef in which they fish. This is a common trend. But in Yap, this is a graph from Yap, you see village number 7 and village number 6 don't fall on that curve. This was super interesting because village number 7 and number 6 were the only 2 very successful MPAs at that time. And so we saw a benefit to the fishermen, and we could turn that into a financial gain over the course of a year. So this took 4 years to get to this point. But when we started showing the benefit to the fishermen, this was finally the moment where they said, okay, we'll accept and support these marine protected areas. And I showed you how they spread to other communities in Yap following this. So that was kind of interesting. And so that brings me to my next red point there in the bottom corner, is that I think as tourists, there's usually opportunities to support marine protected areas, whether it be paying a small fee so you can dive a particular reef, whether it be paying a small fee so you can kayak in a certain area that's normally closed off. I just think that, again, conservation-oriented tourists can look for these opportunities and take advantage and support them. In the case of Yap, it's those fees that support the people living in the house, that support the fish, that took away their crown of thorns, that kept the reef healthy, that then led to more and more marine protected areas around the island. So that's the chain reaction. So lesson 3 here. So where we are in this kind of whole thing right here was marine protected areas are wonderful. I just showed you they can work. But if I was to tally up all of the marine protected areas in the ocean region I work, I could tell you that 45 to 65% are working. So essentially 50% of them are working and 50% are not working, meaning there's not a lot of fish inside of the marine protected area. There's many reasons why a marine protected area might not work. But the main reason is very obvious. You're just not enforcing it. And the fishermen are going inside of it, and we just don't have appropriate enforcement. Yap is a wonderful example of where enforcement works, but there's many islands, and all islands have different cultures. So for all of these reasons, we need to think outside the box. MPAs are great, but MPAs are just not enough. So I'm going to set the stage with this by showing you a reef. That's that gorgeous reef I just showed you in Chuuk that me and Simon dove on like the last day. Now, Simon, I don't know if you've seen this, but I went back a year and a half later after a major bleaching event in Chuuk. This is the exact same picture I'm going to show you right there. So if that doesn't look like fire running across a forest, nothing does to me. That's the exact same reef right there. I got to do that one more time because it was very impressive to me to see that. And that's what a climate change event does. The water temperature gets a little bit too hot. The zooxanthellae in the coral produces a radical oxygen. Coral host doesn't like it. The coral kicks out the zooxanthellae. The coral turns bright white, and all these bright colors come out. And then the coral will eventually die, and algae will grow on the reef right there. And so we start a major regrowth cycle. This is not a minor cycle. Crown of thorns might kill 20% of that reef, 40% of that reef. When we did our data, we lost about 60 to 70% of that reef. So you can see there's a big difference here. So here's another reef, Simon, that we dove. Sorry I didn't show you this. I hope you don't get too disappointed. We're going to talk some better things later on. But that's where it was, and that's when I went back to see it. I could not believe it. It's very hard to see these things. It's hard to stomach them if you have a heart. Here's another one in Koshrai. And so this is kind of like the phenomena we talk about El Nino. Scientists blame El Nino and the disproportional heating of the ocean and carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. I'm not going to get into that, but this is indeed the driver of it. And there have been links. So I stand very firm with the science that greenhouse warming is leading to more extreme El Nino events, and that in turn is impacting a lot of the reefs that I work on. And it's not just reef systems, we know that. But I'll just stop right there. But here's some pretty interesting images, Simon. This is about 3 months, though. This is the next season after we dove, so after we left. So we left in July, and in October, November, this is kind of what was going on. There's a map of Micronesia, and there's a box I put a square on. And now I'm going to show you just how bad the bleaching event was. Okay, so this is NOAA, which is a weather agency run by the United States government, puts out these warnings. And this scale is called DHW, or degree heating weeks. It's how hot you are on a weekly basis based upon 1 degree Celsius. So basically, the higher you are up on this scale, the worse you are off. And if it looks like an atomic bomb just went off the area we just dove, Simon, it's exactly what it felt like to those reefs there. It was absolutely astonishing. Here's another look at it. They also give you a scale. In that scale, there's no stress, there's stress. We think there's going to be stress. Oh boy. And then there's buckle your seatbelt. You are about to get hit by a major forest fire. And that's what happened here on these reefs. Now, I've seen this before in Palau in 1998, but I've never seen anything like it to this extent. And so this isn't unique to our region, but because we were collecting data, we could learn from it. So we use this knowledge, this terrible event, to gain a prediction on the system. So there's the system back and forth. And one of the things we learned was, I'm going to circle this back into fisheries, and you'll see why in a minute. Okay, here's the beautiful reef in Koshrai that I'm telling you about. Here's the terrible event that we discussed just now. If you like the graphical version, there's the graph showing you how much coral died all around the island right there. But then the year after this, so maybe in 2017 when I went back there, again, we've been doing this long term with the Micronesia Challenge. We went back to look, and this is what we saw. So this was very interesting to us. What we saw was an increase in herbivorous fish biomass by up to 150%. So let me give an example. A human body gets sick, antibodies kick in. This is our immune response. Our immune response kicks in, right? We reduce the inflammation, and then our body can slowly get better. I kind of equate this to the immune response of the reef system, if you will, in this picture. This response of herbivores. So this is this response of herbivores on the reef. Now, people have been studying this, not just in Koshrai. We saw this, but again, people saw this in Australia, and they started seeing this in Fiji, and scientists started documenting this and kind of sharing these stories. So what we know is it's incredibly important to protect these time frames when the fish flourish after these major disturbance events. Now, interestingly, we were doing a fish market survey at the same time of this in Koshrai, and Koshraians are quite religious people, and they were pretty adamant that, wow, this is such a good year for fisheries. We are able to catch such a large amount of fish. God has provided us with a wonderful catch going on here, because maybe they don't understand all of the details and the nuances behind what's going on. And so this was an opportunity for outreach. And so we started putting out outreach in the newspaper and explaining. And now how we're working on, I'm going to get to policies later on, but we are working on some policies. And one of the policies we're working on is to kind of hold off on fishing as best possible, put some additional regulations on during these incredibly sensitive times. And it's about a year or two.
I got a couple questions, but we could put them perhaps later. Or maybe you're talking about it now. Anyway, people want to know what they can do. We've got quite a few people from Indonesia, I think, and they want to know what they can do to accelerate reef restoration and what helps. But I think that's what you're about to say, right?
Yeah, I'm going to try my best, but there is no magic. There is no magic sword. There's no dag. There's nothing perfect that we can do. We know what needs to happen. So that natural immune response on the reef has to go, and we want it to be as uninterrupted as possible, right? So not all of those fish I showed you in the picture before are going to live to be adults. It's more than fine to be fishing those fish assemblages, right? Because people always fish, but we need to think about restrictions, and we need to think about just how much fish we take off the reef. So if the fish goes up by 150%, we shouldn't set our fishing quota 150% higher. So I'm not saying we should stop fishing. I'm saying we should manage those situations. Now, as a tourist, I put that in red right there on the bottom. I don't know if a lot of people realize this, but sometimes we go to restaurants, and of course you're in a beautiful tropical location with an ocean and you want to eat fresh fish. It makes perfect sense. And we hope that the fish that we're eating is sustainably caught. And in many cases it might be, but the truth is on many of these islands, we just don't know. Just don't always have an answer as to whether it's sustainable or not. So as a conservation-oriented tourist, one of the things you might do is spend the majority of your time eating pelagic fish, such as tuna, wahoo, mahi. Stick away from grouper, parrotfish, surgeonfish, things like that. That's easy enough to do at the individual basis, and together could make a profound change, but policies are ultimately needed.
So, sorry, before you go to the next one, so just go to this slide. So, I mean, I've obviously get around a bit as well, and I see places where reefs that are maybe not just as bad as on the right side, but similar, are quite common actually, and they never really get to the level that we see there on the left, like we saw them a lot actually in Houk. So if you are in highly populated areas such as Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines, where the fishing pressure is very high, is reducing fishing the main thing? Like, would you say that has the biggest influence on your restoration? As in, should our dive centers in these places primarily push for setting up MPAs and restricting the fisheries, whatever makes sense, but restricting fisheries, or are there other things that should be done? I'm thinking here of in Bali or in Gillies, with lots of heat damaged coral. There's the BioRock initiative. There's sinking things as reefs. I mean, are these?
Yeah.
I mean,
so
I would in terms of comparison.
It's fine to compare things, but I would say those are not mutually exclusive, and I would say both of those are absolutely important. I would secondly say that while I have dove some of those places that you're talking about, I don't have too much intimate knowledge on them, and so it's hard from a scientist standpoint. You don't want to talk about other systems in which you don't really know. I would guess that yes, fisheries would be a big part of the solution. I would also guess that in some areas, this bleaching event has happened 3 times in the past decade. So imagine if that happened 3 times, the reef never has a chance to recover. So yes, we need some restoration to happen in some places. And so the answer changes, but I do believe that fisheries are going to be a big part of the answer for many areas.
I'm going to ask you another difficult question. I don't know if that fits here, but that's a question we get a lot on the trips. Is Palau has basically forbid sunscreen, normal sunscreen, so you can only use
Mm.
reef-safe sunscreen. How big is the influence of a heavily dived area like Gili T, for example? There's really a lot of divers there all the time. If they all wear normal sunscreen, does it actually have an influence on the corals? As in, if we as an island make a push to say no more chemically produced sunscreen, only reef safe sunscreen, so no paraben and whatever these things are that they don't use, then does it,
Yeah.
I mean, do you think that that has a reasonable effect?
So the easy answer to that is if you take a coral, put it in a laboratory, and expose it to sunscreen at high doses, the coral will develop a tumor. There's been papers written about that, or some other sickness. And so yes, it's real. However, how does that scale at the level of a Gili Island or some place like that? And no one has answered that question really well yet, I think. So precautionary is absolutely yes, do what you're saying, especially if the product, if an environmentally acceptable product is out there, there's no reason not to push it and use it, even if it costs a little bit more. And I'm a conservation-oriented tourist, I would absolutely use it. I personally use shirts and things that I can just cover up with as much as I can and use as little of anything I need on my skin. But so yes, but the proof for that, Simon, it's not. I'll just say at the scale of a reef out in nature has not been shown.
Well, I'm happy to support anything that makes sense, but in Palau, where they're actually saying, Palau is not as densely dived as other places, but Palau likes to be on the forefront of
Mm,
future initiatives. Um,
mm,
I just think, how much sunscreen could you be could you be like pouring into the ocean before you would make
right,
a real difference on a place like Palau? So that's why
right.
it's a bit of a contended issue, I would say.
Sure.
Where
I actually tend to agree with you, but at the same time, in high doses in a laboratory, you can see a response. But we don't get those high doses once you get in the ocean. But anyways, I wouldn't focus on that as a major part of the problem here for all these beautiful areas that we love to dive, that we're stuck seeing reefs in the right-hand side of the picture, and we want beautiful reefs. But just imagine if I spent all my time restoring that reef, planting corals, but I didn't control the fish. That coral's going to die anyway because the algae is going to overgrow it. So you cannot have one without the other. And so we need, it's a comprehensive plan. And so in Micronesia, what we've done is, I'm going to show you a little bit more in a little bit towards the end here, but we try and figure out what's the primary stressor agent. I told you at the beginning, for our region, it was 65% fisheries, 35% pollution. Tourism is huge in Palau, but it's not, and in Guam, but it's not that big elsewhere. Tourism numbers are quite low. It's a very intimate tourist experience for most of the other islands. So that's why those percentages are like that in our region. Now, every region is a little bit different. And so I just think that's the, so I'll move on.
I got one last one. I'm sorry. I think that's just because you're later going to be too far away from the slide. If you go one slide back about the decrease in fish population, I think it was one slide back. Yeah, well, whatever happened here, did you also see a drop? So when you had the bleaching event and the coral died and algae started taking over, did you see a decrease in, I hope I'm saying this correct, corallivore biomass, so coral eating fish, so not only scrapers but eaters? Do they decline immediately with the bleaching event?
Not necessarily, because people think that those fish are actually corallivores like parrotfish, but actually parrotfish have a paper came out, they're actually going for bacteria and other more protein-rich things that are kind of below the skeleton. So in the case of corals, you have the zooxanthellae and the polyps that are providing the energy to it. But parrotfish also graze on the reef, and they eat also the algae, and they're going for this thin layer. This is what people have found. They're going for this thin layer that contains the richest things. But what we did find here was the immediate response was, in our data, was a reduction in the amount of algae on the reef and an increase in the amount of calcareous material on the reef. And so that's like having enamel on your teeth, right? And enamel on your teeth helps everything to recover and be healthy. And so that enamel on the reef allows for new corals to settle. Now, it's only 2020, and corals take a long time to grow, so we're only looking at coral recruits right now. But our story continues.
All right.
Okay, so back to that. So started talking about fisheries and the issue of fish. And so this led to our next push, which is the last thing I'm going to close with. But this is a big research field that a lot of my students and a lot of people that I work with are going on. And this is where we kind of hang up the scuba gear and dig in a little bit and work with some of the fishermen and learn a little bit about the fish. Now, in order to make this whole research agenda even function, this is the hardest thing in the world. Try and stop a commercial fisherman and ask them any question. And try to ask them if you can pillage through their cooler with all their fish. And they're going to look at you, maybe punch you, and do as little as possible. They don't want to be bothered. They want their paycheck and they want to go home. They've been fishing all night with a flashlight, and that's just how it works. So in order to make this work, we've set up just really wonderful partnerships with terrific, in this case, we have community college students from the Marshall Islands. And folks like this have just really made this process work. They integrate in with the nonprofit organizations, and they're able to work with the fishermen, and they're able to set up a way in which they pay if they need to, but they make it the least inconvenience possible for the fishermen, and they keep them informed all of the time. Now, this is the data that we need. That fish on a measuring board. How much did you catch on a full moon? How much did you catch on a new moon? How much did you catch in February? That's when they spawn. This is the data we need to ultimately manage the fishery, which will then make the reef more resilient, which will then help protect us from climate change as best we can. We're not going to solve climate change as reef scientists. We hope policymakers will go to something like that. So here's the huge challenge with coral reef fisheries. So I just showed you that there's more than 200 species out there, okay? So it's not like cod. Cod have a big enough challenge. Sea bass, striped bass have a big enough challenge. Halibut in Alaska have a big enough challenge. But that's one species of fish that exists across one huge coast. We have many, many different islands. Each island has a different stock status. Each island has different catches. And so there's so much going on here. We need a smarter way. We can't just take the lessons learned from cod fisheries or halibut fisheries and apply them to the islands. It just doesn't work. And so this is one of the major challenges. And this is why a lot of fisheries programs don't exist, don't work so well out on the islands. So here's an example of just how many species of fish exist out on a reef. If you're a diver, you're probably familiar with most of these. Probably see these on a typical dive. This is their contribution to the landings. This is in the Marshall Islands, but it's pretty typical. This is pretty much the same information that would come from Palau or other places like that. You can see what species are kind of the dominant heavy hitters, if you will. So we're basically taking that information right there. Sorry about the flipping back and forth. And what we're doing is, with those fish collections that we're looking at, we're finding out at what size does the fish start reproducing. So we want to make sure there's a big population. So we can think of a minimum size. The minimum size you can catch the fish is once the fish starts reproducing, okay? And usually we add a buffer effect. So you say, if this is the size that starts reproducing, then you go a little bit bigger. Now, this is a big deal. This takes a lot of data. Like I told you, all these fish are different for all the different islands, and you can't just look at one fish and say, oh, I just found a 10-inch fish that started reproducing. You have to look at hundreds of them. So every species requires almost a different study. So this is multiple years of research, many students, many partnerships, and we can develop things like this, smart kind of guidance. It's not perfect, it's evolving, but it's working. And so this is for the Marshall Islands. They're going to be embarking on this right here. But it doesn't just come with size classes, right? We also learn a lot.
Guys, one question on the side. So you don't have a lower end anymore, like the small, I remember back in the day we would have like, don't fish any juveniles. You would have to, like, when I did like tried to fish for pike in Austria, and they said, okay, if it's less than 30 centimeters, you're not allowed to keep it. But are you completely dropping the bottom end, and you're just preserving the biggest ones?
Out of simplicity, out of necessity, yes. Also, it also depends on the size of your population. I don't know what fishery you were talking about, but for cod or striped bass on the East Coast, that's very easy to do. It's a dominant fish. Every time you throw your hook in, you're going to get one of 5 species, and that's what's going to happen. That would be very difficult for all of these. So we're making some smart decisions, and we're going to see how it goes, and we're going to keep on monitoring the data stream and the reef. And we're very lucky, those partnerships I'm telling you about, to have with the fishermen, that we can go back, and we don't see management as something you do and then it works. We see it as a wheel. You do it, something happens, we look at the data, and then we reevaluate it, and then we do it again. And that's, we're lucky to be able to have some groups to do that with. But what I was getting at was that size limits are obviously great, but they're not going to protect against this. We know some species of fish, and maybe you've paid a little extra money in Palau on a recent dive. I have. It's amazing. If you go on the full moon, you can dive with the aggregation of red snappers, or if you go there in March or May, you can see aggregations of groupers. But you can see fishermen could wipe this out in just a couple of weeks or a couple of months in some instances. But over a series of years, going back to this spot at this magical time, you could easily wipe out this resource, even if you take the right sizes. So sometimes you need more than just a size class, and you need some of these like seasonal bans. So we're excited, Simon. Shortly after our trip in Chuuk, we now have a seasonal ban on groupers in Chuuk during the 3 or 4 months when we know that they spawn. And recently, there was a cooler of Chuuk groupers that made its way to Guam for sale on the market. And because of the species, we knew it wasn't from Guam, found out it was from Chuuk, and the guys came and actually did the enforcement and brought the individual back to Chuuk and enforced it there. It's one of the interesting success stories. It's not always working.
You know, we went back with Javi in 2017 and 2018, trying to find the grouper spawn in on the outer west tip of Chuuk, and
Sure.
they couldn't find it anymore. It was not there. We were there. The sharks were there. Everybody waiting for the groupers, and the groupers weren't there. And one theory at the time was that it might have been so heavily impacted by fishing that, might happen somewhere else or might not happen altogether.
Sure.
But it was like a known thing for many years, and then Javi couldn't prove it.
Yeah. Well, the good news is it came back
now,
this year.
Yeah.
It did happen. It's not formally documented yet, but yeah, perhaps the month shift. That's why we have that red bar. Instead of saying November every year, in some years it might be October, it might be November, it might be December. It's just, there's no perfect certainty. And so that's what we learned based on that case scenario right there. Cool. Okay, and then there's other policies that make sense. And so for some of these species, I think all tourist divers would know these species right here, but these are very special species that are very enjoyable to see on the reef, that are just incredibly vulnerable to even light fishing pressure. And so we see a lot of this going on. In Palau, they did have a ban for 5 or 6 years on the top 2 species. They recently opened it up. That's an interesting story for traditional cultural events by permit, and now they're going to close it again. So they didn't want to close it forever because the locals will never accept that, right? So again, it's working with people. So just a final example of how we work with people. So if we're going to put a size regulation, if you don't like the graphs, don't worry about those things on the top. Those graphs on the top are just showing you the size of the fish that could potentially be caught. So current is the size of the fish that were all caught. Now, if we put a size regulation on that, the fishermen are going to lose money. We know they're going to lose money. They're not going to be able to catch the smaller fish. But we can model the growth rate of that species, and larger fish produce more individuals. They're more reproductively fecund. So we can calculate that within 2 or 3 years, the fishermen subjected to this size class policy will start making the same amount of money and then start making more money than before. So we can calculate the amount of impact to the fishermen. And what do we do with that? We can, hopefully, we don't have control of this, but we can recommend that they raise the price per pound in the market. So the consumer pays a little bit more money during these couple of years when the fishermen are losing money. So now the fisherman has no net loss. The conservation action is happening, and who's paying for it? It's every consumer, little by little. Is kind of like how it works. So that's one example of smart management that we're applying. We have ears open. If you have some ideas, I'd love to hear them. But we are thinking outside the box on this, and we have awesome, again, great networks of people developing this. So I'm going to stop there. I wanted to, start with coral diversity and take you through kind of all the way the conservation picture, kind of as I saw it. But before I stop, I want to, this is our realistic future. We're not going to see those pristine reefs that are on the right. Those guys, that really cool guy with the awesome moray eel around his neck, my favorite picture ever, we might not have spearfishing catches like that, even if it's daytime, even if you do it legally, right? But we don't have to live in that world on the left either, right? There is a more realistic future. And for Micronesia, a big part of that is managed fisheries so we can have reefs. We're not going to have those gorgeous reefs with climate change, but we do want reefs with coral growing on them, and we want to have as healthy as reefs as possible. So that's kind of where we stand. Gosh, like I said, there's just too many people to thank for all of these things that I talk about. There's funding organizations, but then there's also just again, partnerships and networks with everyone from fishermen to regional scientists. But I'll stop there. I think I've taken up enough of your time for one day. And yeah, I just really appreciate everyone logging on and taking their time to listen. So thank you.
Thanks for that talk. I mean, I learned so much from you back then, but then again, lots of things, new ones again today. I think a really, really important note for all of us is, we always talk about coral reef and coral reef restoration. And actually it's fisheries that have this huge impact. As you said, can be different in different places, but it is very important. You did not mention a certain thing that I hear a lot more, like Indonesia, Philippines, is sort of deep sea anchoring, deep coral anchoring. So they'll drop the divers off a reef that is obviously 20 to 30 meters where they dive, and they'll just drop the anchor at 70 meters, but they're destroying a lot of coral down there. I guess it's not maybe a focus statistically that you're looking at, but things like that also need to be approached, right? Because if you have great coral growth and then it just gets hacked away by dive boat anchors,
No, you're right. The islands I happen to work on have been very proactive. So in Koshrai, for example, they drilled mooring buoys. So they put secure lines on the reef at like 50-meter intervals. So wherever you dive, there's a buoy to tie up to. In Palau, they've pretty much done the same thing. In Guam, they're doing the same thing. So I just haven't personally experienced what you're saying, although I know it exists. I'm very sensitive to it. I just haven't experienced it like you have.
So for example, Komodo and Raja Ampat, there is basically no buoy anywhere. So every big ship, they just chuck their anchors in there, and Conservation International and some of the other groups are really trying to get that in now, that essentially you can't be right on the reef with your dive boat. You have to drop the divers and then drift off and come back and pick them up. And well, when we go to these places, that's what we try and make sure that they don't anchor in these areas. But sometimes there's no possibility, but then there should be possibilities, there should be.
Yeah. I just feel like that's such an easy fix of all the problems that are out there. That's such an easy, that's one of the easiest fixes.
I think Raja Ampat is such a good example of a good and a bad example in one. Like on the one hand, it's been really great as an MPA, a no-take zone, and sharks have been coming back, like all the reef fish are up, corals are really healthy. But for example, what you said earlier, if you want to be a responsible tourist, you should be paying your marine park fees. And I think places should collect marine park fees. And some places take a lot, and some places like Raja Ampat don't take very much, and then they use the money to make some silly badge that nobody needs. They should take much more money and use that money for what is necessary, such as the buoys, which I think is super necessary in the center of Raja Ampat. Like there's no buoys anywhere, so I do think that could be hugely improved. Let me just ask you one or two more questions on the. I know we're farly overshot. But 2019 was a huge bleaching in Indonesia. Did you have that as well in Micronesia, or did that pass you by, 2019?
That's so interesting. I have a totally separate talk, but it involves predicting where bleaching will go based upon not only just the El Nino, which goes left to right in the ocean, but also something called the Pacific Decadal Oscillation, which goes north to south. But anyway, the short of it is we did not experience bleaching in 2019. We did in 2016 and 2017, and the hot spots will move around based upon these huge oceanographic modulators. And one of a different piece of research that we're doing is trying to create a website where you can log on a couple months in advance and say, look, I think that bleaching might be coming. Think about it. If I was going to get sick with a nasty flu next Tuesday, I'd love to know on Monday so I can just pre-prepare my chicken soup and get my Netflix ready, and I'll be ready, and I will deal with that sickness much, much better. And so that's the idea of but anyway, that's something brand new that we're just working on now.
I'm going to ask one question to finish. It was actually the first question that Linda asked, but I thought it was a really great finish question because I've seen it with my own eyes. It says, she goes, does the U.S. Army base in Guam help or hinder the reefs? Is it a human stressor? Because you're based in Guam, right?
Yeah, sure. Actually, the U.S. Army base, while it doesn't have a huge amount of human population, and it doesn't have a ton of infrastructure. And the infrastructure that they do have is pretty well managed. And what any military base often does is limit human access to certain areas. So it's kind of creating these de facto marine protected areas, if you will, or less access to some of the reefs. So I would say it's neutral to beneficial in Guam. And they're also very aggressive, and they support conservation and monitoring. And so they've been a good partner so far, while yes, they do some testing, live range ammunition and stuff like that.
What's the general situation? I felt when I was at Guam diving with you and some other people that fishing, I mean, the fish were down quite a bit. I mean, there was not a lot of fishing to be had there. The reefs looked pretty okay, but there was not much fish. And I was told that there's overfishing going on. Is that improved in the last 2 years since I've been there?
It has. Guam is a little progressive, and we got a female governor, and we have a majority female Senate. And I guess females rock the world, apparently, because we just, after 20 years, passed a no scuba fishing bill, which was so contentious among this industry, and they just passed it, and it's a law now. And now I'm working with the Guam Fisheries Department to keep on potentially looking at some stock assessments and seeing what we can do to maybe enhance some of the regulations and improve the catches of some of the fishermen through time. So there's a new view here, but right now Guam reefs are among the lowest in our entire region.
All right. Well, that is good to hear that there's improvement. You just stay online for just a second. I'm just going to lead over just for everybody to note what's coming up. Oops, that's the wrong link. Okay, sorry, I'm back. I hope you can see me again. Sorry, my camera.
Oh yeah, no worries, man. Cool.
Yeah, we've got several talks coming up that are relevant in different degrees, and one that I haven't put up yet, but I've already agreed on will be coming soon is actually Richard Barnum from Palau. I don't know if you know Richie. He's basically working with SAM Tours, has been building up unique diving expeditions, and they've documented over 24 fish spawns in Palau, and he's going to do a talk for us about all the spawns in Palau, from sea bream to the rarer ones, the unicorn ones, and the Moorish idols, and all these ones. So that's going to be a talk, but I haven't made the poster yet, so that'll be updated soon. We've got talks by other photographers, both more artistic as well as Aaron Jacoski is going to talk about animal cruelty and exotic pet trade. So please join for those. Also, I've got a photography series going on currently. One is generally underwater photography. The next session is going to be macro in a couple of weeks. And we've got Photoshop as well, a series about Photoshop that connects to a Lightroom series. So just go into the YouTube channel and see what's all been there. And then you can see if you like that style and catch up and join us for the next ones. Generally, guys, if you want to support what we're doing here, I actually have quite a lot of costs for these webinars. To have the software is actually quite pricey. So if you want to support us with a little tip, that would be great. There's this Fund Me page where you can drop a tip if you like. I am going to send some links that were mentioned today, including a possibility to donate to Pete's work and the Micronesia Challenge. I'm going to send you some links. What people were talking about was the Micronesia Challenge, the study about the Micronesian fishermen, but also there was a question about the study on influencing local fisheries. So Pete, I'm going to need you to point out where I can find those so I can share those. Also, if you had any study that's worth reading about the El Nino effects, there was interest in that. So I'm going to try to summarize that all in an email. Once I've uploaded this to YouTube, once I've uploaded this talk to YouTube, then I'm going to also send everybody who was registered on this talk an email with these links and a way to get in touch with Pete in case you have further questions. And yeah, I think, oh, wait, this is the last thing. I also do personal coaching. It doesn't belong to this talk, sorry. And yeah, I would just like to thank Pete very much for coming. This was really a great talk. And again, you know, it's in our spirit to learn more about coral reefs. And I think today we learned a lot about coral reefs and how fisheries are connected. And I think there were lots of people here from Indonesia who took some ideas that they might take home to their communities and where they work. And so you've done a great thing by coming to us. Thank you very much.